What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 212. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Got another bonus episode for everybody this week, so really excited to be starting out the year putting out so much content. Hope everybody's enjoying the show. Please just find some way, something you could do to support the show. Of course, you could donate to the show. We Patreon, Subscribe and the crypto information are all in the show notes page. I work at antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute, so you could support me by supporting either of those very important organizations, or you could, share the show, recommend the show, give it a rating or review, anything like that. Just, do something to help out the show. Really appreciate it. And that's why, we get such a great response from the audience, is why I'm putting out bonus episodes and stuff like that. Also, because I got a lot to talk about, want to look back on the anniversary, particularly the rhetoric around 1-6, some of what I think are the false narratives and some of the more important things that maybe get left out. Try to put it in some actual context and just not mainstream hysteria. News on Iraq and then on COVID. So a lot of interesting stuff in today's show. Then the last thing you could do is support the show and get yourself some great CBD products at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. That gets you 25% off when you spend $75 or more, and it gets the show a kickback. Great lineup of products at Paloma Verde. I really like their topicals. Typically, I use the sports cream about every day, but I actually gave it to a relative over the holidays because they were in a little bit more pain than I was. So I've been without it for a few days, but I'm going to get myself some more, and I'm sure all of you would like to have some too, or any of their great products, gummies, soft gels, high dosage ed strats, even products for your dog. PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. All right, let's get into the show. Starting off today by talking about 1-6 and a little bit of like news current stuff, but also some of the rhetoric that I was hearing yesterday was just absurd, particularly in comparisons to events like 9/11 in Pearl Harbor. Now, the reason I think it's important to talk about this is they are trying to generate war hysteria. That's why they're using comparisons to those two events. And so, and obviously, if those two events actually had anywhere near the casualties or significance of 1-6, we wouldn't even remember them or use them as comparisons. If you just look at the people who actually died on 1-6, it's 3 Trump supporters dying of medical issues, and then Trump supporter Ashley Babbitt who dies crawling through a window. Now, on that shooting, I still stand by, what I originally said, that it wasn't necessary, that, they could have arrested this woman without shooting her, and I always think that is preferable. However, if you are crawling through a window and there's a guy with a gun there that's separating you and the congressman, I wouldn't, I would expect that they're going to start pulling the trigger. And to be honest, as much as there were actions by the cops that day that I think escalated the amount of violence, and there was unnecessarily violence by police officers, I guess, I wouldn't have been surprised that the cops used a whole lot more force. And so, that is a part of it, is particularly lethal force. I'm surprised a little bit they didn't start shooting people at different times when they were trying to enter the Capitol, like through breaking windows. So I think, calling it like an insurrection or a coup is obviously like way too hysterical and overstating what happened. At the same time, if you're just saying that it's a protest, then that's not like it was a riot. People were attacking police officers. They did break into windows of the U.S. Capitol building and were ultimately able to delay a ceremonial vote to coordinate Biden as president by a couple of hours, I suppose. So overall, it's not that big of an event. other than essentially, the fact that some windows were broken. There was some trash left around. There really wasn't that much vandalism other than, breaking things to get into various areas. It's not like people were spray painting or burning things inside the Capitol or anything like that. And so, this really wasn't an insurrection or anything like that, but certainly there was a chain of events that led to people acting violently, and at times it was the Trump supporters that were responsible for provoking the violence, right? It's not just that police were pepper spraying people for no reason, and then people were responding with pepper spray or hitting cops, which all these things had happened throughout the US in 2020. And so watching them, on one sit, especially the events outside of the Capitol, nothing was really surprising if you had watched any of the other coverage of protests around the U.S. in the past year, other than maybe this was happening at the Capitol. Although even then, the Black Lives Matter protests in D.C. Were, harassed far more, but also, we're doing violent things towards the officers as well. And so, again, not trying to completely dismiss the significance of the protest, but let's try to put it into some context here. Now, because this was the Capitol, not surprised, bunch of people, hundreds of people being charged. They say 725 people in total have been arrested, and the Department of Justice, the FBI, is looking for another 350 people. Most of these people are on misdemeanor charges of like trespassing. I think there's like some kind of charge for disrupting congressional proceedings or something like that. 22% of the 175 have pled guilty to misdemeanor charges. 20 people have pled guilty to felony charges. And in 4 cases, they were significant charges for attacking police officers. And so this guy, Robert Scott Palmer, he's the guy that threw the fire extinguisher at police officers. If you'll remember, not on one sits, but the day after, it began reported that there was an officer that was in the, intensive care unit or whatever, fighting for his life. And I believe on the 8th, Brian Sitnick actually dies. That's the officer, but it's either on the 7th or the 8th that he dies. And, but it was initially like conflated, these two stories, saying that Palmer had thrown a fire extinguisher at Brian Sitnick and that had been what led to his death. That wasn't the case at all. And if you were listening to this show back in 2021, September 20 or January 2021, you would have known right away that didn't happen. I was skeptical from the beginning and had plenty of good reason to be that there was not an officer who was violently murdered on one sits, and I turned out to be 100% right on that, even though that got some real slander thrown my way all over the place, YouTube, Twitter, and stuff like that. People were very upset, but 100% vindicated. Brian Sitnick, by medical coroner, died of a stroke medical episode, not from anything that happened on the sits. He was apparently maced with something, but went home and was fine. Now, there are some things that don't get talked about from the sits that I think are really important. The first is the pipe bomb, which is the reason that a lot of high-profile people were actually evacuated and things, not talking about Mike Pence or some of the members of Congress, but particularly like Kamala Harris. And I believe this was also the reason the police officer was looking for AOC and why she was like on lockdown in her office, was because of the pipe bomb that was planted outside of a political office. And so there's still no idea who carried out or who planted that pipe bomb or anything like that, which seems like it should be one of the bigger things discussed and one of the real demands to figure out what the hell was going on there. But there's really no talk of that. And then also, I gotta mention that you have all these people either in Congress or elected officials now, but particularly the members of Congress who talking about fearing for their lives and things like that. And I feel how you feel about them fearing for their lives, but they really were not able to take up any perspective of what they do, how many people, millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world that they may fear for their lives with their policy decisions. And it happened to them once, and they want to make it out to be the most traumatic thing that ever happened in the entire world, but have no perspective. And on that day, look, nobody who was defending them or anything was killed, or even right there were pretty brutal beatings of police officers. That guy outside with the flag or the stick or whatever, he's slamming it on the officer's head. The guy that threw the fire extinguisher at the officers, these are serious weapons that they're using. They in the right circumstances could have killed someone, but didn't actually really come close in any sense. So for you to then say, oh, I feared for my life, and to stand by that a year later seems rather absurd. But even if you're standing by that, to not have the perspective of, if that trauma meant that much to you, imagine what our foreign policy is doing to other people of, the people of Yemen or Afghanistan, who are constantly living under far more, the people around them actually die from U.S. bombs, right? They have real reason to fear the U.S. war state, whether it's the Saudis or the Americans dropping the bombs, or the Iraqi military, whatever, whatever country is dropping the American-made bombs and the American-made fighter planes authorized by the U.S. president and the U.S. foreign policy. That's that's another level of terror, but there's no perspective on that, how much that must hurt those people and impact their lives. It's just, it doesn't get discussed or whatsoever. And it kind of makes me think that this is theater and they're really just pretending, or else if they have real trauma, they might have some empathy with other people who are being put through and experiencing that trauma. So let's see, the last one I think I have here is, of course, Ray Epps and the narrative that is put forward by not, just right-wing media, but that's a somewhat coherent narrative. If you read the Revolver pieces, they ask questions, they don't have full answers, but real questions about this guy, Ray Epps, and how much of what happened on 1/6 was the actions of a coordinated group, and what, I guess, connections that coordinated group has to any other actor. They mainly mention the FBI or something like that, these were dupes in a FBI stooge plot or something like that. But at the same time, these could have been henchmen of John Bannon or Steve Bannon or something like that, right? It doesn't necessarily have to mean if they were in a conspiracy, it would be a conspiracy that helps the Trump narrative. But if there's a couple pieces at Revolver on this, but if you want, you could just go and find all the information on Ray Epps by pretty much just putting his name in the Twitter search, and there's a lot of hashtags around it. But also, if you look through the Revolver piece, click on the links, you could find all the video, far more video that you need just to understand, but really to see that before the day on 1/5, the day before this event, he was out there calling for people to go into the Capitol. What we gotta do is go into the Capitol. He's at the Capitol building before Trump has even called on people or finished speaking to go to the Capitol. And so it's not necessarily obvious that he would be acting at the behest of Trump. You see him at several points outside of the Capitol. And so, the Capitol grounds are pretty large, and there's barricades set up around them, manned by just a couple of officers. And so you see him at two of these places, at least, having conversations, or at least short even interactions, would maybe be also a way to describe it, with 2 or 3 people who eventually instigate taking down these barriers. It's also important to note that after these barriers are taken down, they're hidden. And so if you're just approaching the Capitol, and I think on a normal day, there wouldn't be barriers in these locations. And so after Trump finishes speaking and tells people to go to the Capitol, there are people who then leave who like couldn't have known that these barriers ever existed because they were taken down before Trump finished speaking and they left. Right. So, who is Ray Epps and why hasn't he been arrested and charged? Who is he connected? There's a lot of questions around him and some of the Oath Keeper members. Also, this guy who was on the tower who kept demanding that people push forward. And again, I don't want to get into all this, and I'm not exactly convinced by this narrative that, maybe there was some kind of FBI plot or something behind this. But there are some real questions about people who are heavily involved in instigating violence on the sits who haven't been arrested or charged, and figuring out why they were doing what they're doing, I think is really important to understanding what happened on the 6th. So that's most of what I have on like the memorial and everything of it. I really hate the way that this is being handled by elected officials, basically on both sides. There are some people who have like decent takes on it, but a lot of the pro-Trump Republicans are just completely trying to dismiss it or really push beyond even what like the author at the Revolver piece is stating in his piece, as this was for sure some kind of anti-Trump conspiracy, or to mention that Trump had nothing to do with it. Even if you can't like say like freedom of speech and all that, there were things that Trump could have done to de-escalate that situation. And from reading various stories, and while they are all published at the Washington Post, they do talk about like interactions that people had with Trump, before Ashley Babbitt was killed, telling Trump to like tell these people to calm down because they would listen to him. Now, it's 100% possible that they would have reacted like they reacted when Donald Trump like told them to get the booster or something like that, and just boo them and continue on with what they're doing, because I do think in a lot of ways the Trump movement is far bigger than Trump, and people who just put it as like a whole Trump cult of personality really misunderstand what happened in 2016 and in 2020. But it probably would have helped to de-escalate this situation for a lot of people. A lot of people there, were Trump sycophants, and if Trump said go home, they probably would have. And after Trump did tell people to go home, I think they were kind of already at that point. After the shooting of Ashley Babbitt, a lot of people, it was like, we're just like, oh, this is real and don't want to die. And if it was a real coup attempt, they were probably willing to die for it. They weren't willing to die, and so they all just went home. And Trump put out the tweets and everything like that. But Trump could have done far more to de-escalate the situation here and to protect his people in that sense. The people dying there were Trump's people, and so had Trump told them to turn back, maybe Ashley Babbitt wouldn't have died. And that's not necessarily to say that Trump is more responsible for her death than the cop that shot her or anything like that. But, Trump, he's the president of the United States, man. At that time, he has a lot of power. And when people are dying in his name, he has a way to prevent it. So all that on one sits. Also want to mention here that the Capitol Police Force wants to hire an additional 840 officers. Look, if there's just a bunch of cops standing around or on reserve in case like a bunch of people show up at the Capitol building again, that's one thing, but I don't think that's what this is. The Capitol Police have vastly expanded their powers. They're putting offices and police departments all over the country. This is a part of the domestic war on terror, as I talked about in the beginning of all this. They're comparing this to 9/11, Pearl Harbor, because this is war rhetoric, because they're changing the game and expanding the domestic war on terror. It's no longer just about Muslims. They're really looking at and to target white supremacists. And so they've given the Capitol Police a lot of power. Of course, members of Congress spend billions, trillions of dollars a year. They're constantly screwing people, ruining people's business and everything like that. And not to mention, this is a country of 300 plus million people. And so I could say from my personal professional job experience that, there are crazy people, who we call crazy, but people who have mental illness who are either misunderstood or delusional, but mean absolutely no harm, and who call different congressmen and will say, like, if you do this, your children will regret it. And while if you talk to them, they may say, well, yeah, this is going to harm the environment and that's going to make her children regret it, but the way it sounds and everything like that. So there are those situations, but also people do have their lives ruined by the policies of Congress. And I'm sure people get, really upset and will call a member of Congress or will post like a inappropriate meme or an inappropriate statement on Twitter advocating violence. And I think the plan of the Capitol Police with these additional officers is to start to investigate and to look into all of this. And I think it's going to come and probably, even if it starts just very close to the line, it definitely will exceed the line and start to violate our free speech and everything like that. And they'll any criticism of a congressman, especially whoever's decided to be the protected party at that time, you criticizing them could get you a visit from a Capitol Police will really tone down people's criticism. All right, now let's talk about the cops. A couple stories here on the qualified immunity, and this is the principle, of course, that largely allows state employees, not just police officers, but prosecutors, social workers, judges, etc., to violate the law. Typically, police officers either killing people, conducting illegal searches, stuff like that, things that are clearly constitutional violations, but they get away with claiming this principle of qualified immunity, or like prosecutors that they take part in like fabricating a case or something like that, they cry qualified immunity. Same thing with social workers who make things up. And so two recent cases, one handled by the Third Circuit Court, and the officers who are seeking qualified immunity are alleged to have hid evidence that would have cleared a man falsely accused of murder, and they, along with the prosecutor, kept that information from the imprisoned man for 25 years. And so, this is hiding exculpatory evidence. We'll talk about this a little bit more later on in the show, but hiding that is something that in the past prosecutors have hid behind the principle of qualified immunity to get away with, right? So you got a witness or something like that, you don't test other evidence, you don't talk to other witnesses, things like that happen, and that may not actually get you violated and caught up in with the qualified immunity. You may get granted qualified immunity still with that, but I guess in cases where you actually hide information that is exculpatory, you will not get qualified immunity, and I guess you could face civil lawsuits, from the families of the people or the people who had their lives. This guy spent a quarter of a century in jail for a crime he didn't commit, and these people knew he wasn't guilty, and yet decided anyways not to share that information with him. Then you also have the 10th Circuit Court deciding on the case Marisa Tugel, who was a caseworker in the Colorado Department of Human Services. And while investigating a suspected child abuse after the death of a 2-year-old child, she fabricated a story and a confession that led to Crystal O'Connell to being imprisoned for child abuse. And so the story of what happened was, I guess, O'Connell had her kid in the care of another person who tripped and fell, and that caused brain injuries that eventually led to the child's death. O'Connell, I guess, stuck with that story, but Miss Tugel fabricated a confession saying that it was a case of abuse, and I think the child was like shook or hit or something like that, and O'Connell went to jail, and then Miss Tugel asserted that she would have qualified immunity because there was a no prior case law that would have made her aware that fabricating a confession and handing it over to police to be used in prosecution was a violation of that person's rights, which is, of course, absurd. And so, these are kind of easy cases for people to lose qualified immunity, but it's a really important principle to talk about. And so these are real wins against it here, even though it seems like, it should be obvious. It isn't always. The city of Baltimore will pay out $8 million to the family of Malcolm J. Bryan, who was wrongly imprisoned for 37 years. He did get out of jail before he died, but then he died a few months later. And so Bryan was convicted of the murder of Tony Bullock in 1998. And what it seems like is there was some tampering with the witness, this young girl's friend, who I'm sure was also very young, to get her to say that Bryant was the killer. And then they ignored other evidence, and so they didn't test DNA evidence. And then there was another witness who had a conflicting story who they kind of left out and didn't really talk about. And so eventually the Innocence Project got their hands on some fingernail evidence, and then some the evidence of the shirt and other DNA. And it was clear that it was not Mr. Bryan's DNA on her shirt, and that was enough to get the conviction thrown out. And I guess the prosecutor didn't seek another one. And so, really a shame that this guy has spent his whole life in prison for a murder that he did not commit. I guess, that his legacy will get something from this, maybe a little bit of restitution, a small amount of justice that can now be handed out. But, this is the problem with the U.S. Justice system, is that it's just injustice all over the place. Another similar case, this is Willie Stoats, spent 37 years behind prison for a murder there's no reason to assume he committed, I guess, and he does have an alibi for, so it does seem like he's probably innocent of this. This is in Philadelphia, and what happened was police officers, and I'm not sure prosecutors were involved or not, got a guy, lined him up as witness. This guy is gonna go down big for a whole bunch of things that he actually did, but they want to get Stoats convicted on a different murder. And so they get this guy, and they allow his girlfriend to come visit him in prison and have sex with him. They tell him that he's only going to go to prison for 2, 5, maybe 7 years at the most, even though he's committed some pretty serious crimes. And they also give him condoms and bring him other women. So assuming prostitutes, but I mean, I guess I don't know under what circumstances these women were hopefully consenting in some way to have sex with the witness here. And so, that's bad enough that this guy is convicted off of that kind of testimony. However, it came out actually, and the man's name, I believe, is Franklin Lee. What was the name of the witness who got the sets and everything like that, that he actually was convicted of perjury for that testimony. And so he ends up going to jail for perjury on that, but they don't let Mr. Stoats out of jail or even inform him of that. And so once the judge, I guess a judge finds out and it gets in front of a judge, this actually does lead to Mr. Stoats getting out of jail. I'm guessing that the Philadelphia prosecutor is not going to launch a new case against Mr. Stoats, but I don't think that this was dismissed with perjury or something, and so it will it can't possibly be brought back up. And I think they have about 140 days that they could do that for. On a few shows ago, I talked about this investigation by Customs and Border Protection agent Jeffrey Rambo. Mistakenly on that show, and correct myself here, I called it Operation Whistling Pig. It's just Whistle Pig. And there's a big expose on it in Yahoo News. If you want to go back, listen to that episode and check out that Yahoo piece. But just to follow up, they are launching an investigation. It's an internal investigation, so the Department of Homeland Inspector General's office is overseeing it. We shouldn't expect too much truth to come out, but an internal investigation will be had into the Counter Network Division, which is where Jeffrey Rambo worked. Last story on the cops today is that the Bureau of Prisons head, Michael Caravaggio, will be resigning. His tenure has been an absolute mess, and I talked about on the show not that long ago how there's important parts of the First Step Act that could get people out of prison through different kinds of programs that reduce recidivism that haven't been put in place because of the way Bureau of Prisons is negotiating a labor dispute. All right, let's talk about COVID. And, along with Brian Sitnick, one of the first things that I talked about when people were talking about COVID lockdowns, just something I was right about very early on, was that the pandemic was going to push a lot of people into poverty. And I'm not talking about, American poverty, which, is serious, but people have things in America when they're impoverished, but we're talking about poverty on a global level. This is people living on less than $2 a day. And an additional 97 million people have been pushed into poverty in 2022 due to the lockdowns. And that is, an increase for the first time in 20 years. Other than that, the number had been plummeting. And so not only have you reversed the trend and are likely, probably to keep it going in that direction until you allow things to return to a much more reasonable level of normal, but you've also undone all the progress that was being made, progress that will likely never be made up for, which, when we're talking about people being moved into poverty, we're talking about significantly increasing their chances of dying, especially in the young and the old, really reducing the average lifespan, of people when you move them into this level of poverty. Now, there is an extreme level of poverty below this that I would be interested to see if that's also increased, but I haven't found those numbers anywhere yet. Largely this is an issue that hasn't been talked about, though. People are so caught up in the lockdowns and everything like that. Very little attention is paid to what impact this is happening on a global sense in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, in all these places where they're, in Latin and South America, where there's people who, for them surviving is a difficult part of life. There's no grocery store, or if there is, they typically don't have money for it. There's not like SNAP programs or things like that are really making up the calories. Maybe you could get handouts from UN World Food Programs, but a lot of times those are few and far between. In war zones, it's even more difficult. And when you take away all the ability of global resources to get where they need to go, those most marginalized people are, going to be the ones that get squeezed out of having food. And I just worry that number is actually far higher than the number of people who are dying of COVID. And when we're looking at COVID deaths, not that people who are younger can't die, not, somebody my age could get COVID and die, it happens. Children could get COVID and die, it happens. But you're looking at people starving to death. Children starve to death. It's not usually adults. And so, if we're increasing the number of people who are dying because of poverty, it's likely to be biased in the other direction, where COVID's the elderly, for poverty, it's the very young. And I'm sure the poor, the elderly too, but particularly the very young. All right. Biden is considering these travel restrictions that I think will probably not be put into place, but I'm not so sure about. He said if medical advisors recommended it, he would put into place a vaccine restriction or mandate for travel on airlines at least, and I'm guessing this is going to include bus service and like Amtrak train service as well. Although maybe it's different if it's like a local state service, like I know like the Chicago state line runs into Wisconsin or something like that. Maybe that wouldn't count, but I'm sure Amtrak services would, right? And so this would be a really serious step up. And one, I guess, the real question I would ask that I'm not seeing being asked is throughout the entire pandemic, both administrations, Fauci, everyone has insisted that air travel is safe. And this was pre-vaccine. Now, if you're wearing a mask, air travel is safe. And so what would be the increased risk to people traveling with being unvaccinated if wearing a mask on a plane when everybody was unvaccinated was safe? Now, I questioned all along if that was true or not, and I'm still very skeptical of that, but I don't know. If that is the case, then how are you deciding this scientifically? And I think just reveals, when you look at it that way, the real purpose of this is to force people to get vaccinated by making their lives more inconvenient, but not really having an actual like health scientific reason behind it. And we've seen in the past that when Anthony Fauci thinks that something will be for the greater good, he's willing to tell lies to get people to believe it. Let's see. Biden is ordering more of the COVID Pfizer pills. These are the ones that if you take them, I believe you had to take them pretty early on after you get COVID, but they're really supposed to help, according to like the data that's been put out, not get as bad a case of COVID, get over it faster. It's called Paxlovid, and the Biden administration will now be buying 20 million doses versus the 10 million doses they initially planned to buy. Not quite sure why they're preferencing this over the Merrick pill, and exactly how much they're paying for it, and how all that's working. But potential for, I think, massive corruption here. And also could be if there are more of these anti-COVID pills and they do work enough to that the U.S. government is buying 20 million of them, does that mean it's time to end any lockdowns and restrictions? Because, if there's an effective way to treat COVID and you just make these pills widely available, are any of the other measures really that important? You have the U.S. Postal Service asking for a temporary waiver from Biden's vaccine requirement. This, I guess, would be the OSHA requirement that the USPS is concerned about falling under, and they say that not a lot of their employees have been vaccinated yet, and they're having trouble lining up testing. They're saying that part of this reason, and this actually sounds somewhat understandable, is that they just got through their really busy season. People weren't able to take off work and all that, and so I don't know, maybe that made sense, that there are people at the post office who will get vaccinated who haven't yet because of that reason, although the vaccines have been around for quite some time, so I'd be kind of surprised that that was actually the case. Maybe the company or the post office feels like they're going to be able to push people more now that they're not so busy with other things. They're not worried about people quitting in the midst of the time where they really need all hands on deck and things like that. An interesting note that I picked up in this article is that while the mandate, the Biden mandate, will take effect on January 10th, that's only technically because OSHA, the agency that's enforcing it, says the agency would not issue citations until February 9th. And so with this now being in court, my guess is that we're going to have the decision from the Supreme Court before this actually is in effect. A couple other important court decisions here. A judge ruled in favor of Navy SEALs seeking religious exemptions from the COVID vaccine. I think there are 35 SEALs that were suing, saying that they should be entitled to getting religious exemptions that essentially were not being offered by the Pentagon at all. I don't think anybody's gotten them, or maybe one or two people have only gotten the religious exemptions now. And the judge said that the Navy cannot disqualify them or deem them permanently non-deployable for refusing to be vaccinated for religious reasons. And it'll be interesting to see how far this case goes and how much is going to impact other members of the military. But it's the first court win I've really seen for anybody in the military. While this is going on, the Navy announced they removed 20 sailors who refused to get the COVID vaccine, although I do believe they were in what would be the equivalent to the private sector probationary period, the first 180 days of duty. I really have some questions. Now, I guess if maybe 180 days ago was just before it was very obvious that the Pentagon was going to put in place this vaccine mandate, but I don't know, maybe it should have been obvious by then that they were going to put this vaccine mandate in place. So I have a little bit less sympathy for you if you're trying to join organizations that have the mandate in place and then you join and they kick you out, which seems to be the case with these 20 sailors. As far as I could tell, the Marines have been the far most aggressive with removing their members for not getting the COVID vaccine. I've been talking about what's happening with the Oklahoma National Guard throughout. The general in charge of it and the governor were pretty united against saying that their guardsmen did not have to get the vaccine. And what the Pentagon did is, as expected, they leveraged what they fund and said that those guardsmen will not be able to participate in the drills that they need to participate in to retain their active duty guardsmen qualified guardsman status, can participate in the guard and everything like that after January 1st. And the Oklahoma Guard lost in court on that. And so that's the situation for them. Georgia is deploying their National Guard and spending $100 million to boost hospital staffing. And, this is one of those things that, look, everybody's talking about the hospital staffing and everything like that. This is a major issue, but it is a self-created crisis here. We required all the hospital staff to have COVID vaccines when a bunch of people, first of all, the mandate for the hospital staff was the first. And so, people are far more skeptical, I think, 4 or 5 months ago than they are now. So that's a part of it. But also, a lot of these nurses were people who had already had COVID. And so, now you have a problem that you forced all of them to quit with staffing. And it's just another self-created crisis here, a lot like with the poverty crisis that we're now facing on a global scale. All right, just mention quickly, the U.S. is giving away a bunch of COVID vaccines. 664,000 are going to Nepal. I believe these are all going through the COVID program. I can really only find the U.S. announcing these, by the way, on the State Department Twitter account. I can't find any official announcement from USAID, the National Security Council, or the State Department, the organizations ahead of determining who gets these vaccines exactly, how they're making these, the decisions on who gets them. But it does seem largely that countries that the U.S. wants geopolitically to ally with it are recipients of a lot of vaccines. Also, countries who are able to successfully lobby in Washington, D.C. are getting vaccines. Overall, Nepal has gotten 2.2 million doses. Pakistan got 5 million shipment of doses and then a second one. And so that has brought the total number of the U.S. vaccines to Pakistan to 42 million. All these again through COVAX. Egypt is getting 1.5 million doses, and the U.S. says that over the past 4 months it has delivered 16 million doses to Egypt. And then Angola and Ghana are getting 2.5 million with 800,000 going to Angola and 1.7 million going to Ghana. Let's move on and talk about Haiti, where a suspect was arrested in the assassination of Haiti's president. This is not the person who was arrested in Turkey. This was somebody who initially fled to either Jamaica or the Jamaican consulate and then was denied legal reasons to stay in Jamaica. His either asylum request or whatever he was seeking was denied. And so he decided to try to travel to Colombia, which is, I believe, where he's a national from. And en route, I believe in Panama, he was picked up and then brought to Miami. His name is Mario Antonio Palacios, and it appears, or at least reports say, that he's cooperating with U.S. authorities. Don't know exactly what that means, if he really had a role in the assassination or not, but I have been following this assassination and want to discuss this. It's interesting that he's in a U.S. court, and I'll see what the U.S. and keep you up to date on what the U.S. does with him. Now, the man that he is accused of assassinating are being involved in the assassination of, and I think he actually says he was there during the assassination but didn't have anything to do with it, so that's kind of suspicious, is the former leader Jovenel Moïse. But the current leader of Haiti, I think the presidency seat is empty, but there's a prime minister who has control, and that is Ariel Henry. And he was at an event, this, I believe, on the 3rd of January, and a firefight broke out between an armed group and his security team. It's reported that he escaped unharmed, and that one person died and 2 others were injured. Unclear if they were bystanders or people involved either in the militant group or in the security team. I don't think, and I tried to look a couple yesterday, and I did not see any public statement or anything from Ariel Henry since. He canceled events later in that day, and so I'm a little bit suspected that maybe he's injured or at least a little bruised or something. Maybe he's just psychologically really shaken up, but typically leaders try to really capitalize on these events to seem like a straw man, and it doesn't seem like Henry, at least not yet, has done any of that. He's largely been absent, I think, in public life since this assassination attempt. Then in Haiti, we had 2 journalists killed in a shootout possibly between rival gangs, but I believe the journalists may have actually been the target. There were 3 journalists who were interviewing either a leader or some representative from a gang, and another gang pulled up and shot and killed 2 of the journalists and injured the 3rd. So that's what's going on in Haiti. I feel like I'll have more news on Haiti in the coming weeks, especially as the trial unfolds in the U.S. of the man that's accused of being involved in the assassination. In Iraq, drones and rockets are falling on bases that house U.S. soldiers. So on the last show, I think that would be episode 211 that I did with Connor Freeman, we discussed that on the second anniversary of the assassination by the United States of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani at the Baghdad airport, that there had been, I believe, 2 drones fired at the U.S. military around the Baghdad airport, and those were intercepted but had the Soleimani revenge painted on the wings. And so following that, there was a second attempted drone strike. I believe this was on the Aden al-Assad Air Base, where U.S. soldiers are housed in Iraq. I think those were intercepted and didn't get anywhere near the base. And then there was a rocket attack on troops at the airport, where U.S. forces are housed, but no injuries were reported. I don't think that these were intercepted, that, at least one of these rockets actually was able to strike the base. And then a fourth such thing came 4 consecutive days in a row. Here, Dave DeCamp writes at antiwar.com, U.S. coalition shoots down drone aimed at base in Iraq as attacks continue. For a 4th day in a row, a base housing U.S. soldiers in Iraq came under fire. The U.S. coalition in Iraq shot down drones that were heading towards the Aden al-Assad Air Base, which is located in the west of Baghdad. So I believe after the second of these attacks, the U.S. came out and said, we have a right to self-defense, even though our troops in Iraq are occupying forces, and that's why people are firing drones at them. Our troops have a right to self-defense. And, while people do have a right to self-defense, you don't get to claim a right to self-defense when you're occupying another country. And so, I see that as problematic, but interesting that I haven't seen like any major airstrikes being carried out against these forces in Iraq. And while I'm surprised at this and haven't seen it yet and almost hesitant to say something, this doesn't seem to be having a major impact on the negotiations between Iran and the U.S. and European powers in Vienna, although I really suspect that'll change. But if I'm wrong, I'll happily be wrong. Margaret Griffiths has the year-end death toll from Iraq in 2021. These are, people confirmed to have been killed by war violence or war-related violence in Iraq. It's 1,625 people with another 2,000 wounded. There were also 484 bodies that were found in mass graves. The lower than the number in 2020, which was just under 2,000. Of the dead, the Islamic State was responsible for about 1,300 deaths, and those deaths the total deaths include 380 civilians, 439 security personnel, and 487 militants. My guess is that the security personnel include the Shia militias of Iraq, and the militants would be ISIS or anyone else. Then there's also the fighting that's going on between Turkey and the PKK, where at least 313 people were killed. The PKK lost over 250 members. 38 Turkish military personnel were killed. So a lot of fighting still going on in Iraq, even, today. These deaths not part of that total, but I believe 5 members of the PKK were recently killed by Turkish airstrikes in northern Iraq. And then last story I have here to talk about today, and I don't know, it's not probably super interesting to the audience. This is to do with the UK. For me, I really don't remember a whole lot about Tony Blair or this guy, Jeff Huhne, who was the UK defense minister at the time. I remember Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and George Bush, Paul Wolfowitz, that cast of characters in the United States. But, at the same time, these people did play an important role. And, the UK going along with the US was important in generating the Iraq war and all the propaganda. And, these are people that also were in power and should have known better and could have done more to stop it. And so Tony Blair has recently announced that he's going to get knighted. So that's generating a whole bunch of rightful hate in the UK. Although I gotta say, I really can't care about who gets knighted at all. And then with the Hoon thing, though, this is interesting because he's alleging that he was given a memo before the Iraq war saying that the Iraq war was likely to be illegal, but he went along with it anyway and was even told to burn the memo. He decided not to. What he should have done is make it public, but he cowardly stuffed it away in some safe. And so, I don't know, it seems like he pretends like he gets some credit for something in this story because he didn't burn the memo and didn't come out publicly about the memo. But, if he didn't do something to stop a war that he read a memo of that was likely to be illegal, seems really problematic to me. Yeah, that's what I have for today's show. Everybody, hope you're enjoying the show. If you continue to support and share the show and everything, I'll continue to put out more and more content, including bonus episodes, and have on great guests like Scott Horton and do all the great work that I'm doing. Thank you so much for supporting the show, and I'll be back with more episodes next week. YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey for video version, anywhere you can listen to podcasts, including the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed. Facebook, Twitter handle is @con_interest. I'm @Kyle Anzalone_ on Twitter.